Welcome back to Newt's World. I'm Newt Gingrich. Over the last 3 episodes, we've looked at government waste, at fraud, and at the economy. Today I want to do something a little different. I want to show you issues, dozens of them, drawn from years of polling by my own team at America's New Majority Project, along with independent pollsters, where 70% or more of the American people agrees across party lines, and then ask a simple question: which party is actually willing to align their votes with the American people's values? We've been polling at America's New Majority Project since its launch by the late Bernie Marcus in 2018. Bernie was a great patriot, and in his years growing Home Depot, he'd come to have great faith in the citizen customers his company appealed to. He was worried about the trench warfare of narrow fighting, which was beginning to tear the political governmental system apart. He asked us to take the lessons we'd learned from working with President Ronald Reagan and developing the contract with America to develop a new polling project where we could determine the top issues which bring the American people together with huge majorities. I'll tell you up front, building block 3 of this platform sets the bar at issues polling 70% or higher. And I've held that bar pretty honestly, rather than stretching weaker numbers to fit it. Parental notification policy in school, for example, polls very well among Republicans and independents. But the most detailed survey I could find showed barely half of Democrats on board, landing the overall number in the mid-60s, short of even this relaxed bar, whatever I might think of the policy on its merits. Mass deportation in the abstract had the same problem, anywhere from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, depending on how you ask it. So those didn't make the cut. But I'm going to walk you through a genuinely wide range of issues that did clear 70, some landing in the 70s, plenty clearing 80, and some even 90. And I want to be precise about which is which as I go, rather than blur the line. I want to explain my method up front, because I think it matters. For an issue to make it into this episode, I required at least one well-documented poll, and ideally 2 independent ones from different organizations, landing at 70% or above within roughly the last year to 2 years. Where a number cleared 80, I'll tell you so explicitly, because that's a meaningfully stronger consensus than 70. I'm not going to blur 70 and 87 together just because they both cleared the bar. Some of these numbers come from my own organization's polling, America's New Majority Project, which my team has run for 8 years, and I'll flag those explicitly as our own data. That's a stricter standard than most political commentary applies to itself on either side of the aisle, and I think it's the only way an episode like this earns your trust rather than just your applause. So let's start with photo identification to vote. Pew Research Center, August 2025. 83% of U.S. adults support requiring all voters to show government-issued photo ID. Only 16% oppose it. Gallup, October of 2024. 84% in favor, including 98% of Republicans, 84% of independents, and 67% of Democrats. This is not a Republican position with a thin veneer of bipartisan support. CNN's own polling analysis found support crossing racial lines too. 85% of white respondents, 82% of Latino respondents, 76% of black respondents. I want to give you a sense of just how consistent this finding is, because one poll can always be an outlier. This isn't one poll. A McLaughlin and Associates poll conducted for U.S. term limits in July of this year found 82% support for requiring photo ID specifically to register to vote, and a sample deliberately split evenly between Trump supporters and non-supporters. My own organization's polling, America's New Majority Project, in May of this year, found 77% agreement that requiring government-issued photo ID to vote is simply common sense, with a companion finding of 79% agreement that requiring proof of citizenship to register is likewise common sense. Different pollsters, different question wordings, different months, different sponsors, including my own, and every single one lands in the high 70s to mid 80s. That kind of consistency across methodologically independent surveys is rare in polling in anything, let alone something as politically charged as election administration. I'll also give you the fair caveat, because Pew's own survey didn't stop at voter ID. The same poll found broad majorities also support expanded early voting, same-day registration, automatic voter registration, and restoring voter rights to people with past felony convictions after they've served their sentences. So this isn't really a story about voters wanting elections locked down across the board. Voters want both easier access to voting and identification requirements at the same time, in the same poll, from the same respondents. And treating those as contradictory, the way cable news often does, is a mistake most voters simply don't share. So here's the question worth asking. If 2 out of every 3 Democratic voters support voter ID, why is the House-passed Save America Act still sitting stalled in the Senate? Congressional Democrats, as a bloc, have opposed it. Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia has argued publicly that ID requirements get used as what he calls a pretext to shape the electorate, pointing specifically to policies in which, in his telling, a student ID isn't accepted for voting purposes, but a military ID is. That's a real argument, and voters deserve to hear it stated fairly. But the gap I want you to notice isn't between Republicans and Democrats. It's between Democratic voters and Democratic elected officials in Washington. Part of the procedural reality, the bill needs 60 votes to clear a Senate filibuster, not a simple majority. So even full Republican support isn't enough without real Democratic votes. And so far, despite polling in the 80s among the public and above 2/3 among Democratic voters specifically, it hasn't gotten them. That gap, not the culture war caricature, the actual measured gap between what a party's own voters want and what a party's own representatives deliver, is at the center of what I mean by the American Party. After the break, an issue where the gap isn't even between the party's voters at all. It's something stranger than that. Second issue, term limits for Congress. And this one might surprise you because it's not really a partisan issue at the voter level at all. The NPR PBS News Marist poll found 83% of Americans support limiting how long members of Congress can serve, including 78% of Democrats, 89% of Republicans, and 84% of independents. A separate McLaughlin and Associates poll from January of 2025 found nearly identical numbers, 83% overall, 79% of Democrats, 85% of Republicans, with only about 8% opposed outright. My own organization, America's New Majority Project, tracking landed at the identical number, 83%, which is about as clean a piece of cross-validation as you'll find between an independent pollster and our own research. This has been stable since at least 2017, according to the Program for Public Consultations tracking. I'll note one more data point for balance. A July 2026 Rasmussen poll put support somewhat lower, describing it as more than 2/3 of voters rather than the 80+% other pollsters found. A reminder that even on a consensus issue like this one, exact numbers move around depending on the pollster and the moment, even when the broad conclusion doesn't. While we're on the subject of Congress itself, 2 related findings from my own team's research are worth mentioning here rather than saving for later. 80% of Americans support a maximum age limit for members of Congress, including 78% of Democrats and 83% of Republicans, almost exactly the same cross-partisan pattern as term limits themselves. And separately, 86% support banning members of Congress from trading individual stocks in office. Legislation that just passed the House is Congressman Brian Stiles' Stop Insider Trading Act, H.R. 7008, a bill that prohibits members of Congress and their spouses and dependent children from purchasing stocks and requires public notice before these individuals may sell stocks. It passed the House on July 22, 2026, and is now with the Senate for consideration. And by the way, the vote was 232 in favor, 198 opposed, with only 13 Democrats voting in favor of the bill. Age limits and a stock trading ban aren't the same policy as term limits, but they come from the same place. A public that has decided across party lines that the average rules of accountability that apply to everyone else in American life ought to apply to Congress too. Here's the honest part. At the voter level, this is about as close to a genuine national consensus as you'll find on anything. 79% of Democratic voters agree with 85 to 89% of Republican voters. That is not a partisan gap. That's a governing class versus the people gap. And I think it's worth explaining why that gap exists rather than just asserting it. The average member of the current House has served 8.6 years in office. The average senator, 11.2. 23% of the current House and 47% of the current Senate have already served more than 12 years, the exact threshold most term limit proposals would impose. Asking a sitting member of Congress to vote for a bill that would eventually end their own career means asking them to act against the strongest single incentive in their professional life. That incentive doesn't care what party the office holder belongs to. What is different is which party's office holders are currently willing to introduce legislation against their own long-term interest anyway. And it's worth noting plainly that some of the very Republicans who have co-sponsored term limit legislation would themselves be term limited out under their own proposal, which is a harder, more self-sacrificing position than voting to limit only other people. But look at who's actually introducing that legislation. In January of 2025, Senator Katie Britt of Alabama and Senator Ted Cruz of Texas reintroduced a constitutional amendment to impose term limits on Congress, joined by 10 of their Senate Republican colleagues. In the House, multiple joint resolutions to the same effect were introduced in this Congress, again, Republican-sponsored. I looked for a Democratic co-sponsor on the record. I couldn't find one on the current bills. So you have a policy that even a strong majority of Democratic voters support, and yet the actual legislative vehicles carrying it forward in Washington are exclusively Republican. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really a mystery either. Incumbency has its own gravity regardless of party, but only one party's office holders are currently willing to fight that gravity in public, on the record, with their names on the bill. This isn't even a new fight. Versions of this amendment have been introduced repeatedly since 2017, with consistently strong bipartisan public support behind them, and none has ever received a floor vote in either chamber. That's not evidence the idea is unpopular. It's evidence that popularity alone, without a critical mass of office holders willing to act against their own career incentives, isn't enough to move legislation in Washington. After the break, I want to take you well beyond Congress itself into the economy, healthcare, and the border, where the numbers get even more striking. Let's move to money, because this is where some of the widest margins in all of America's new majority projects polling show up. Middle-class tax cuts. 87% agreement that we need to cut taxes for middle and working-class Americans to grow the economy. Only 7% opposed. That's an 80-point net margin, about as close to unanimous as polling ever gets. Eliminating federal income taxes on Social Security benefits, 83%. Consumer choice on vehicles and appliances, that consumers, not the government, should decide between electric or gas, 84%. Pursuing energy independence, even if that means using domestic oil and natural gas, 75%, with a separate poll finding 72% oppose banning gasoline vehicle sales outright. All of that is our own organization's polling, and I want to be straight with you that it's our own data, not an independent pollster. Now, healthcare. Genuinely one of the strongest clusters agreement I've found in 8 years of this research, requiring hospitals and providers to give patients clear, upfront prices before they receive care, 84%. Reducing prescription drug prices by cutting out the middlemen in the supply chain, 87%, the single highest number in this entire episode. Giving patients and doctors the power in healthcare decisions instead of insurance companies or the government, 78%. Requiring hospitals to publicly post prices for all their services, 73%. I want you to notice something about that entire cluster. Every single one of those ideas is about transparency and power shifting toward the patient, not about who's covered or who's paid for what, the more ideologically loaded questions where Americans genuinely do split by party. Those aren't 50-50 partisan fights in the polling. These are 73 to 87% landslides. That's the heart of the Republican health care plan we will cover in the next episode of the series. And it's worth knowing the public was already there before the legislation was. One more cluster of issues after this. The border, and something a little different. What Americans actually believe about this country itself. On the border, the numbers are almost as consistent as the healthcare cluster. Requiring local law enforcement to check immigration status and detain illegal immigrants for deportation if they're arrested for another crime, 83% support from our own polling in March of 2024. Securing the border and fixing the law before deciding what to do with people already here illegally, 74%. Requiring all U.S. employers use the federal E-Verify system, 72%. Hiring 22,000 additional Border Patrol agents, 76%. Requiring asylum seekers to enter the country legally at designated points of entry rather than in between them, 75%. I'll give you the honest exception here, too. When we ask the more abstract question of whether illegal immigration is simply bad for the United States, support dropped to 61%, a real majority, but well short of the consensus level on the specific, concrete enforcement steps I just walked through. That's an important distinction. Americans are far more united on specific border policies than they are on how to characterize the broader issue in the abstract. And I think that distinction gets lost whenever this topic gets discussed in sweeping terms on cable news instead of specific policy terms. On education and parental rights, 79% say parents should have the final say in their children's education. 77% want transparency requirements so parents know what instructional materials their children are being taught. 74% say women's school sports should be limited to athletes who were born female. 73% say English should be the official language of the United States, and 71% believe the federal bureaucracy needs what we phrased as a major overhaul to fight corruption. Now, the last cluster, and I think it's the most important one, even though it's the least policy specific, what Americans actually believe about this country, independent of any particular bill or regulation. Being grateful to be an American, 86% from the Cato Institute's America 250 survey. Family as the single most important value across virtually every demographic group. Over 80% call it important, with 49% ranking it their single top value, more than double the next closest answer, which was freedom at 30%. Being an American as a core part of personal identity, second only to family, 83%, though Republicans were notably more likely than Democrats to base their identity on country, 53% to 37%, a real and telling gap. And freedom of religion, as important to America's identity, 80%, confirmed independently by both Associated Press, NORC, and Ipsos. On the more specific question of whether America is currently the land of opportunity, that number drops to 61%. Even our shared gratitude for this country comes with real, honestly reported reservations about whether the promise is currently being delivered on. I include that last cluster deliberately because it's not a policy argument at all. It's closer to a national character reading. And what it shows is a country that agrees overwhelmingly on what it values: family, freedom of religion, gratitude for the country itself, even while disagreeing plenty about the specific legislation that flows from those values. I think that's actually the most hopeful finding in this entire episode. When we come back, a different kind of consensus, not about policy or spending, but about identity, family, and how we treat each other. And I'm going to tell you up front where my own organization's numbers don't match what other pollsters are finding. Everything so far has been about government, what it costs, what it should do, who it should serve. This next set of issues is different. It's about who we are. Let's start with something that should be uncontroversial, and on the numbers, mostly still is. My own organization, America's New Majority Project, found 91% agreement with Martin Luther King's standard that the content of a person's character matters more than the color of their skin. And 73% chose equal treatment and equal opportunity over equal results and equal outcomes. Those are about as close to universal as polling gets on anything touching race in this country. Here's where I have to slow down and be honest with you, because building block 3 of this platform only works if I hold every number to the same standard, including my own. My organization has also found extremely high numbers on national pride. 90% grateful to be American, 85% proud as recently as June of last year. I want to give you those numbers, but I also want to give you Gallup, because Gallup has asked essentially the same question every year since 2001, and their numbers tell a genuinely different story. As of Gallup's most recent poll, just 58% of Americans say they're extremely or very proud to be American, the lowest number in the 25 years they've been asking, down from 67% the year before, and the extremely proud share alone has fallen to the low 30s. Part of that gap is almost certainly the question itself. Grateful and proud aren't identical sentiments, and how you ask shapes what you get back. But a 40-point gap between two legitimate pollsters on a question this basic isn't something I'm going to paper over. What both surveys agree on is this: patriotism has become sharply partisan, with Republicans consistently reporting pride in the 90s and Democrats and independents falling much further and much faster. That partisan gap, more than either top-line number, is probably the real story. On family and parenting, the numbers are more consistent across sources. My organization found 73% agree parents should have the final say in their children's education, and 77% support parental transparency and access to school curriculum materials. On the more specific question of gender-related school policy, 80.9% called it crazy for schools to encourage a gender identity change without informing parents, and a separate poll found 80% support advanced parental notification when schools address these topics at all. Independent pollsters land in a similar place, if not always at quite the same height. Gallup's own annual tracking on gender-affirming care for minors finds what it called a slim majority opposed, and a survey from the American Principles Project, a group with its own point of view, so to take it as one more data point rather than gospel, found 56% support for restricting these treatments for minors, and 63% say children are too young to make the decision at all. The exact numbers move depending on who's asking and how, but the direction is consistent across every pollster I could find. A clear majority, not a fringe position. On abortion specifically, my organization's polling from November of 2023 found something I think gets lost in how this issue usually gets covered. The strongest consensus is not around a single restrictive law. It's around practical support for women in difficult pregnancies. 90% support better pre- and post-pregnancy care and coverage. 88% support cracking down on violence targeting pregnancy resource centers. 86% support holding men financially responsible during pregnancy. And 84% said support for women facing unplanned pregnancies would do more to reduce abortions. I'll be straight with you. This particular cluster comes from our own polling rather than a mix of independent sources. I didn't find another pollster asking the exact same support-centered questions in the same way. So treat the specific numbers as one organization's finding until someone else replicates them. But the underlying instinct that most Americans want to help women rather than simply punish them tracks with the broader, well-established findings that large majorities across many pollsters favor abortion remaining legal in at least some circumstances while still supporting real limits. I want to close this segment the way I opened it by telling you where the numbers agree and where they don't. On character over skin color, on equal treatment, on parental rights in schools, on wanting real support for women in crisis pregnancies, the consensus is broad and it's genuinely bipartisan. On national pride specifically, I gave you my own organization's number and Gallup's, and they don't match. And I think you deserve to know that rather than have me pick whichever one makes the better argument. One more issue after this, and it's one where the number is real and clears the bar, but it's worth walking through exactly how solid the ground under it actually is. On this next issue, you already heard part of the story in our episode on the affordability plan, work requirements for able-bodied adults receiving public assistance. Let me be specific about what work requirements actually means in the law now in the books, because the phrase gets thrown around loosely on cable news without much detail. Under the provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, able-bodied adults without dependents, generally between the ages of 18 and 64, are required to work, train, or volunteer at least 80 hours a month, an average of 20 hours a week, to maintain eligibility for food assistance benefits. There are exemptions built in. For people caring for children 14 or older gets treated differently than caring for younger children. Deferrals for certain Native American populations, and a general allowance of 3 months of benefits within a 3-year period for people who aren't currently meeting the work requirement, so nobody loses benefits the instant they miss a shift. This isn't a bill that says work or starve with no on-ramp. It's a phased structure with real exemptions built into it, and I think the details matter for judging whether the polling support tracks the actual policy or just a vaguer, tougher-sounding version of it that exists mostly in people's heads when a pollster reads them one-sentence summary over the phone. The American Enterprise Institute's polling from earlier this year found 75% support for requiring non-disabled adults to work or actively seek work to remain eligible for welfare benefits, with only 22% opposed. The Manhattan Institute survey from just 2 weeks ago found 74% specifically for the work search requirements included in this year's federal law. Both clear the 70% bar comfortably. This is not a borderline case, although it isn't in the 80-plus range some of the other issues reach. Let me give you the fuller range of what the polling shows, because I think it's more honest than picking a single favorable number. A 2023 Axios Ipsos poll found 63% overall support for work requirements generally, 80% of Republicans, 66% of independents, and only 49% of Democrats. A real partisan gap, unlike voter ID or term limits. But when Wisconsin voters got to decide this directly rather than just answer a pollster's phone call, they passed a 2023 ballot measure requiring able-bodied welfare recipients to at least search for work, with almost 80% voting yes, a real election result. It's never dropped below a clear majority in any poll I could find going back 3 decades, and a clear 70 in every single measurement. And as we discussed 2 episodes ago, the version of this that's now actually law, the work requirements including the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, passed without a single Democratic vote in either the House or Senate. I was actually in the room the last time this country fundamentally rewrote its welfare rules. In 1996, as Speaker of the House, I negotiated the original federal welfare reform law with President Clinton, a Democratic president, working with the Republican Congress on legislation that also imposed work requirements. That bill passed with substantial bipartisan support in both chambers, a real contrast to what we're describing. The policy consensus among voters didn't go anywhere in 30 years. The bipartisan legislative coalition that used to exist around it did. When we come back, I want to tell you exactly what I think this pattern means, and just as importantly, what I don't think it means. So let me be precise about the argument I'm making, because I think precision matters more than volume here. I am not telling you 80% of Americans are registered Republicans, or that 80% of Americans approve of the Republican Party's brand. We covered that terrain honestly back in episode 1. Both parties are underwater in favorability right now, and Republicans have real work to do earning trust, the same as Democrats. What I am telling you is narrower, and I think historically more important. On a specific and growing list of concrete policy questions, voter ID, term limits, congressional age limits, and stock trading, middle-class tax cuts, drug pricing transparency, hospital price transparency, border enforcement specifics, work requirements, parental rights and education, support for women facing difficult pregnancies, and the shared values Americans hold about character, equal treatment, and this country itself. Supermajorities of Americans, cutting across party registration, agree with each other. And on that list, it is consistently Republican office holders introducing the legislation, casting the votes, and taking the political risk to try to deliver it, while Democratic office holders in Washington, not necessarily Democratic voters, but Democratic office holders, have most often stood in opposition or remained silent. I think it's worth asking whether that pattern holds. I don't think the honest answer is simply that Democratic politicians are out of touch in some general cartoonish sense. Part of it is structural. In a Democratic primary electorate that skews more ideologically consistent than the general electorate, as we discussed in episode 1, a candidate who breaks from the party's default position on an issue like voter ID risks a primary challenge from the left, even if the general election electorate agrees with the break. Republicans, at least on the specific issues we've covered in this episode, don't face that same primary pressure in the other direction. And there's a second institutional layer on top of that. Washington interest groups on the left, particularly groups focused on ballot access and voting rights litigation, have built entire organizations and funding models around opposing measures like voter ID, regardless of what rank-and-file Democratic voters tell pollsters. And that kind of organized, well-funded advocacy infrastructure has real influence inside a coalition, disproportionate to its actual numbers. Neither of those is a moral judgment. It's just how the incentives currently sit, and it's worth understanding rather than just repeating it as a talking point. I want to leave you with a caution, too, because I don't want this argument to curdle into something it isn't. The fact that a policy polls above 80% doesn't automatically make it correct, and the fact that a party's office holders resist a popular policy doesn't automatically make them wrong on the merits. Sometimes the majority is right. Sometimes representatives have information or concerns the polling doesn't capture. And it's Congress's job in our system to deliberate rather than simply enact whatever a phone poll says. I happen to think the office holders are wrong on the specific accountability issues we've walked through here. But the honest version of this argument rests on the size and consistency of the polling gap, not on the assumption that elected officials who disagree with the poll are automatically corrupt or out of touch. Sometimes they are, The polling alone does not prove it. The polling combined with the specific, documented incentive structures I walked you through, primary pressure, interest group influence, incumbency protection, is what makes the case, not the top-line number by itself. That's the case for calling this the platform of the American Party. Not that Republicans are personally more popular, not that the party's brand is beloved, but that on the specific things 7, 8, sometimes 9 out of 10 Americans actually agree on, one party's elected leadership is consistently the one willing to write the bill, and I'd rather make that narrow, well-sourced case than the broader, sloppier claim the Republicans simply are America and Democrats simply aren't. That broader claim wouldn't survive the fact check. This one does. Let me tell you what I hope you take away from this episode specifically. Not a scorecard, not a reason to feel superior to your neighbor who votes differently than you do. What I hope you take away is a habit. The next time a politician from either party tells you the American people want something, ask them for the poll. Ask who conducted it, when, and exactly what question they ask. Most of the time, in my experience across 5 decades in this business, the claim doesn't hold up to that kind of scrutiny. In this episode, across every issue we covered, I did that work for you, and it held up. That's the standard I think this whole platform should be judged against. Episode by episode, issue by issue. Not whether it flatters the party I spent my life in, but whether it survives someone actually checking. Next time, we turn to health care. The Republican plan to make coverage more transparent, more affordable, more available, and how it holds up against the numbers, including the parts that don't hold up perfectly. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at Gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.